Okay, hello everyone, and welcome back to The Clear Lens. So, on the back of our three-part Epstein series, we're going to talk about something today that's a little bit lighter and very special. So, we're going to talk about how our relationship to the land has evolved over time. So, how our origin stories and our myths are intricately tied to right relationship with the land, how we celebrate the coming and going of seasons, and how attunement with nature was directly correlated to our health as a people. How we lived in communally owned tribe lands where chieftains had no jurisdiction over land. It belonged to the stewards, which was the people, who most respected and revered it. Colonization changed all of that and spelled disaster. This is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about how Indigenous communities, although they represent just 5% of the Earth's population, protect 80% of the world's biodiversity, and how indigeneity and right relationship to the land is key not only to our health, but actually our survival as a species. So, Dara, how about that? Does that sound like what we're going to talk about, plus more?
Sounds beautiful. Yeah. Wow, what a great introduction. I'm excited already.
We're going to start at the beginning, our origin stories as a people, our myths.
Yeah, that's a great place to start. Actually, even you saying this of like going back into the origin stories, I know we've talked before about John Moriarty.
Yes.
And he has this beautiful kind of lecture, this 3 hour long lecture on like learning to walk beautifully on this earth. And he talks about this is like, when you go to therapy and you kind of start off by, going back to your childhood and, trying to figure things out from there. So I think this is a nice place for us to start
Oh,
too.
I
And
love
in,
that.
in terms of
Start at the beginning. Where did it all go wrong?
yeah, yeah. Where did it all go wrong? Exactly. And there's a lot of things that have gone wrong, but at the same time, there's a lot of deep learning and understanding we can do from those who have gone before us and have
Mhm.
figured things out and allow us really to start from a higher place of consciousness, I think. So when we look
Yeah.
at these myths, so the word myth, even, I think, is something that's often misinterpreted. And when it comes to myth, really, these are some of the most powerful social technologies, really, that we have as a species. And they're really kind of foundational for how other things really work in society and in the economy. So, just as an example now, kind of the prevailing myths that lie at the foundation of modernity, let's say, would probably be two core ones. And one of them is coming from Christianity, in that the earth is essentially run by a powerful man in the sky who's able to control everything on earth, and that it's this binary really between good and evil is sort of
Mhm.
the Christianity's main myth, you could say, and then that was largely replaced, or at least there was an evolution from that, kind of since the onset of capitalism, where Earth is machine and
Yes.
humans have control over this machine. And humans are separate to this machine. So humans in this period have kind of become God themselves.
Yes.
So within this is also a big part of the separation between humanity and nature. Murray Bookchin would call this first and second nature. So first nature kind of being wilderness, natural cycles, second nature being humanity and human-made systems. So within this we see over time this what is sometimes called this disease of separability. This is what there's a wonderful woman called Vanessa Andreassi who describes kind of the root cause of our problems as this disease of separability, which is largely a result of coloniality, really.
Hmm.
So when we think of this disease of separability, what are we ultimately trying to do is to cure this disease and to cure this disease through the re-acknowledgement of interconnection, interdependence, and to try and recreate a sense of belonging.
Hmm.
Coming again to an understanding of we belong here, and that throughout human history, actually, humanity has played a very positive role in the deliberate creation of abundance or fertility
Yes.
throughout the world. So there's kind of an assumption now that humanity are just bad and that like it leads to a lot of nihilism, I would say, in terms of
Mm.
people saying that humanity just deserves to go extinct and we just should, fade off into further obscurity as we take the rest of the planet with us. And this is something I would completely dispute
Yeah.
because for the vast majority of people who have lived on this earth, the vast majority of cultures, have actually been what are known as a keystone species. Like, like a keystone on a bridge, kind of
Hmm.
holding things together. And you
Okay. Yeah.
see in the cultures that exist today that would be called First Nations or Indigenous cultures, they still are very actively contributing to life in its totality.
Hmm.
And with this, we have to understand then the root cause of environmental breakdown, of essentially this poly crisis that we're facing on Earth today. It's mind-made problems as a result of a socio ecological system that is actively destroying its own foundations.
Hmm.
And that is most obvious today in the contradiction between the capitalist growth paradigm, which essentially says that capitalism, which is centered around endless accumulation. That's kind of the key purpose of capitalism as a system. And that
Yeah.
is ranging from the individual, in that you have to continuously accumulate wealth in order to survive. You're always thinking about the car, the mortgage, whatever.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
that is your kind of key to uh, security and to escape precarity. And when we look about how to sort of overcome this precarity and to get this sense of belonging back and to overcome alienation and come back to place, it's important for us to try as best as possible to resynchronize with the ecosystem we depend on. And to me, this is
Yes.
sort of what being indigenous truly means, rather than being like just native to a place,
Mhm.
is are you in harmony with the ecosystem you depend on? And are you actively contributing to its ability to reproduce
Regenerate.
itself?
Yeah,
Exactly, to
because you understand that your life is linked inseparably to the health of the ecosystem around you. It's like you said, that first and second nature. Um, yeah, that is incredible. And in terms of Ireland and our relationship with nature and how that was built in
Mhm,
to our codes of life, our ways of life, our understanding of life.
mhm,
Like you called it social technologies, but we hear about the fairies, the daoine maithe. We
mhm.
hear about these traditions that were linked to nature and the unseen forces that were understood to kind of, I suppose, have final say on our well-being, and that if
Yeah,
we didn't revere them, we'd pay the price. Like how every Irish person knows you don't mess with a fairy fort.
yeah, yeah,
Or
even today. Yeah,
and it's totally respected, like gospel, and certain traditions around the seasons, around the coming and goings and seasons. You were to observe these traditions or meet
Uh-huh.
your end or at
Yeah.
least your peril, you know?
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
it's really interesting to hear you describe those as social technologies, really and truly.
Yeah, I
Like,
mean, like ultimately, these are what kept us alive, you know?
yeah,
And again, when you look at indigenous cultures around the world, I mean, these are cultures which have existed for thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of years,
yeah, it
where
worked.
yeah, the average Western civilization typically will last a few hundred years, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
So within these, I mean, we have to understand that there are very active forces at work throughout myth, throughout ritual, throughout seasonal practices, throughout story, or these archetypes that are deliberately created and passed down through generations in order to preserve social and ecological harmony. And that's what that's what we depend on for our continuation, really.
Hmm.
So when we look at Ireland, for example, so if you look back to what sort of pre-Christian and pre-colonial Ireland actually looked like, was Ireland was essentially run by the goddesses, first and foremost, the goddesses. So Ireland comes from Éire, comes from Éiriu's land, Éiriu being the goddess of, first and foremost, of sovereignty and fertility. And she's part of this triple goddess with Banba and Fola. And this idea, even of sovereignty and fertility, is a really deep one. And I think it's
Mm,
particularly important for today when you hear the word sovereignty thrown around and very devoid of context. But essentially, this sovereignty, it meant actually the sovereignty of the land itself, being
yes.
that the land itself has agency, it has rights. And these rights were even codified into Brehon law,
Mm,
where you could receive very severe punishments for something like felling an oak tree. That would be a similar punishment to assaulting a chieftain. You know, that's how
wow.
important the
Mm,
landscape was in Irish culture in this period. And you could be sentenced to death. It could cost you 100 and, I think, 68 cattle for felling a sacred tree. And within this, you had much more advanced rights for women than you've had at any point since in Irish
yeah,
history.
we had it so good. Yeah.
Yeah, and like even the sort of other goddesses, so Bridget, for example, would have been an enforcer of these laws to ensure
Mm,
that women were allowed to have property passed down to them, which was constantly under threat from males who kind of wrestled the balance away from women through accumulation of property.
hmm.
So within this, we see even the likes of fairies as a way of nature defending itself in some way, of Eru defending herself. So Eru, you see this idea also, Eru being the representation of the land itself, but on a broader scale, you see this in lots of indigenous cultures, most famous of which is like the earth as a whole. In Pachamama, you hear a lot in indigenous communities of what's now called Latin America, or Gaia in Greek. Um, Philosophy as well represents largely the same thing as like a living organism in itself. And
Hmm.
the fairies would have been essentially a mechanism of preserving a reciprocal relationship between first and second nature. So
Yeah.
reciprocity is really the key principle of sustainability. And that
Hmm.
being, as long as you're extracting more than you're giving back on a long enough timescale, it's not sustainable. It
It's going to
won't
end
be
in
sustainable.
disaster. Yeah.
And we'll get to this later, but this was represented in something called the Law of Replenishment by somebody called Carl Liebig, which Marx then used to do his analysis on the Irish soil in the lead up to the
Hmm.
Irish famine. But this idea of reciprocity, that being if you are in an extractive relationship with the ecosystem, that you'll be punished in some way.
Yes.
And as you mentioned, in Ireland, your fortunes were really always tied to how you treated the environment. And
Hmm.
this idea of right relationship, you see it reflected in lots of stories, the most famous of which is probably the king having to essentially marry the earth
That's
goddess in some
right.
way. And this earth goddess is represented in many ways, but like, and with many names. Like even like Kathleen the Houlihan and all these people, they're kind of represented as like a hag, like a kind of
Mm.
old woman character who's not meant to be particularly attractive.
Mhm.
But the king will have to engage in some sort of kind of sexual relations with this hag and as a sort of wedding, as in he's wedding himself to the land, and his legitimacy is then judged on the fertility of the land.
Yes. It's
And if
incredible.
the ecosystem is degrading, he loses his legitimacy to rule.
Yeah.
So these are sort of key mechanisms to preserve and protect the ecosystem which the people depend on. And as I said, they exist across cultures in very similar ways, actually.
It's so clever and genius because you're tying an authority figure essentially to the health of the environment, which is ultimately the authority.
Yeah.
So it's like it's conditioning it so that man can never be above um nature or the laws of nature. And I suppose at the point of time we're in now, the exact opposite is happening, where man thinks that he is above the laws of nature, but isn't. Yeah, there's a perfection in it that's
Yeah.
yeah, pretty
And
beautiful.
even like, the spirals that you see, like to me, these are such deep symbols where,
Mm,
you have firstly just the single spiral, which essentially represents the natural cycle and also communicates to a certain extent like that there is an element of history repeating, but within the natural cycles of nature. And even this idea of winding down and scaling back up can be seen in
mm,
this sort of idea of even kind of growth and decay to a certain extent. Then you see this expanded on into the double spiral. And to
yes.
me, this double spiral, the way I interpret it, is this sort of dynamic harmony and interchange between first and second nature. And a lot of ecological economists would refer to this as social metabolism, as
Yes.
essentially the relationship between society and nature. And even, this idea of like imbulk, of
Mm,
like this
mhm.
idea of metabolism, or another way to think of it is like a digestion, even,
Yeah. Mhm.
input, throughput, and output of materials through the economy,
Mhm.
with human labor sort of mediating the relationship between first and second nature. So you see this kind of connection between the two, and the purpose of human culture in this time really is to try and preserve this harmony. And
Yeah.
again, you see this across cultures, and probably the most developed form of it is something called the Tao, which is a kind of ancient Chinese philosophy. And it's one of these philosophies that like they explicitly say in it's called the Tao Te Ching. It's the second most translated book in history behind the Bible.
Mhm.
And they say explicitly, like, you can't name it or describe it because it's just essentially just means the way,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they say, like, what you're always trying to do is essentially just let the way flow through you,
Mm.
And this idea, humanity aren't trying to save nature, we're trying to let nature save us,
Yes.
right? We just need
Mhm.
to essentially
Exist.
accept that whatever bullshit AI and stupid technologies that we've built, nature is the most sophisticated technology that has ever
Hmm.
existed. It's occurred over billions of years worth of evolution. And we need to sort of open ourselves back up to how nature actually works. And this contradiction, I think it's Gregory Bateson who was one of the kind of forefathers of systems thinking. And he says, like, basically the root of our problems as a species is the contradiction between how nature works and how humans think. And
Mm,
this
that's
is part
perfect.
of the repair that we need to do is how can we, as best as possible, just mimic what is already happening in nature as a society.
Yeah, that is beautiful. And, when you talk about digestion, and actually, I suppose what prompted this conversation was something you had read about called metabolic rift, which I suppose, yeah, at first kind of sight, it's not easily understood, but what it really means, if you're to break it down, and you and I have talked about this before, Dara, you explained it to me, that we could think of it as kind of a digestion process, nature's natural digestion process, and how
Yeah.
important that is. And that feeds into this, reciprocity between humans and nature. Um, and what kind of blew my mind about that, and how we can think of just how unnatural imperialism is, and extracting resources from one territory to move it to another, just how unnatural that is in terms of how nature works, was the soil exhaustion in Ireland as a result of colonization. Now, I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but I just want to explain what that kind of principle means, that metabolic rift. And we can talk later about, the soil in Ireland and how it has been exhausted through the process of colonization.
Mhm.
But it was kind of a revelation to me to hear about how, when food is, I suppose, produced on a given land, whether it be cattle, whether it be crops, and is
Mhm.
then just like, in a really crass, blunt way, extracted from that place and
Mhm.
exported overseas, as we see is the case. Ireland was the granary for Britain. We were Britain's kitchen. We fed Britain. That was the role designated to Ireland by England. And the impact that had on the health of the soil, because
Yeah.
the nutrients weren't being returned, because there's this natural cycle where the food produced is the return cycle is how it is, I suppose, returned to the land after being processed by humans,
Yeah.
by people, nutrients returned to the soil. I never thought of it like that, and how unnatural systems, even like the urbanization of society and sewage systems, they pollute rivers instead of regenerating the land.
Yeah.
And even the cattle fertilizing the soil, they just disappear because they're taken off the land. I found that mind blowing.
Yeah, it's such an amazing analysis. And, even for me, having like, studied sustainability, been lecturing sustainability and ecological economics, and then this study, and it was done basically by Marx in an address. So the main analysis, it comes from notes from Karl Marx that he made giving a speech in defense of the Fenians.
Yeah, this is incredible.
In 1867, he was giving this speech in England to the workers in England to call for them to support what he was calling a socialist agrarian uprising in
Mhm.
Ireland. And it was extremely progressive. It was anti-imperialist. It was, the land for the people was kind of the slogan you often heard
Mm.
related to the Fenians. I say that Marx was perhaps the first eco-Fenian.
I
Uh,
love it.
this,
Yeah, we all need to be eco-Fenians.
yes, we do.
I'll take that title up.
And even the Fenians, I mean, where do they get their name from? The Fianna, like,
Yeah.
and you see it all throughout these even other agrarian resistance groups, like we talked before a little bit about the white boys in the
Mm,
east of Ireland, Nabucco Bana, and they would have pledged their allegiance to Queen Sive,
yeah,
and
yeah.
same for many of these leaders. And
It's fine.
what did Marx do is so really the best part about Marx's analysis is this dialectical method. And what does this method look at? basically it starts from the perspective um, that reality is in a constant state of unfolding, of
Hmm.
becoming at
Yeah.
all points. Nothing is ever static. And that means you need to be constantly taking into account, like, not only the stocks, but also the flows. And this is flows of people, of money, of nutrients. And this is what really makes his analysis so useful, is he did a really insightful analysis on basically nutrient export and soil quality in terms of the output per acre, in terms of the food that was able to be provided, and situates this in a historical materialist perspective. So
Hmm.
with this, he basically looks at the processes of land use and colonial agriculture which led to the famine.
Yeah.
And he uses Liebig's law of replenishment, that being you have to be replenishing at least as much as you're extracting in order for something to be sustainable. And what he saw with the British colonial agricultural system in Ireland is this shift away from what had been the majority had been subsistence tillage farming to eventually pasture, in particular cattle.
Yeah. And we say
And
tillage, a variety of crops at the time, Dara. There was a variety in it, wasn't
yeah,
there? Subsistence. Yeah.
so
Okay.
wheat, corn, potato would be the main
Hmm.
three. And to kind of start in terms of like the indigenous Irish land practices. So the best known of which is something called the Rundale system. And Rundale, that comes from the Irish Rin Dála, which is essentially like division meetings of some sort.
Yeah.
And one way to even interpret the Irish quarter day festivals and the seasonal calendar is basically these festivals like Lunasa, Bealtaine, Samhain, etc. Then the solstices, the equinox. So these can be interpreted as like essentially mechanisms for metabolic alignment, you could say, or calibration between first and second nature, where they would have met, and the days of the seasons is essentially when the metabolic activity of the soil is switching into a new state based on the energy of the planet driven mostly by the sun. So you
Incredible.
have the like digestive activity happening below the surface, and you
Hmm.
see these kind of cycles of growth, of sort of sustainability, then of decay and kind of regrowth in this cycle. And at different points of the year, society would have needed essentially to recalibrate its activities based on the natural cycles. So this would have meant dividing up the produce of what had been grown. It would have meant dividing up the land in a fair way based on the
Hmm.
fertility of the soil and the output per acre, based on maybe population change in terms of birth and emigration.
Incredible. Just on that one point, Era, just about how the division of land based on the fertility of that land. It's not about the size, it's not about anything. It's based on this deep understanding of what this field can do, what it's capable of, what its purpose is. And then there's like a rotation between people's access to that. So, for example, let's say you have a really high output field, the same person doesn't get the benefit of that all the time. It's shared. There's such beauty in that. And you know what came to mind as you were saying it as well? Mancon's book, 32 Words for Field.
Ah, yeah, yeah.
Just the beautiful appreciation for the, uniqueness of things and for like the capability and the purpose of different things and using things according to that, you know.
Yeah.
Um, oh, it's gorgeous. Sorry, I
Yeah,
interrupted you, Flo.
no, it's a great point, and it's like also, part of the reason why sometimes people go to rural Ireland and they see these random walls that like seem to follow no logical structure,
Yeah.
or they even look at the fields and they see all these little hills that don't seem to have formed naturally. But essentially, the reasons these walls would look like this is just based on trying to distribute fairly the land based on the output per person so that in theory everyone can have an equal share of the food. And that's
Yeah.
kind of part of it in one way. And then there was also just general communal lands that were managed collectively, that people would have had their cattle or their animals grazing on collectively. And these communities were essentially structured as there was like infields and outfields with different purposes.
Hmm.
So within this, you do have a very fair and sustainable way of managing the land in communal fashion. And again, when you look not only in Ireland, but across the world, and you see really the kind of escalation of hierarchies, kind of first through feudalism and then intensified further through capitalism. The
Hmm.
struggle really is over the commons versus enclosure, that being communal ownership of the land or private ownership of the land.
Yes.
And communal ownership allows for right relationship because the people working the land are the people dependent on it and therefore are actively contributing to the sustainability of it.
Hmm.
Whether private ownership, where the purpose is profit accumulation and expansion, you're in an extractive relationship.
Hmm.
And you are likely an absentee landlord who's not necessarily dependent on the produce of the work. So that means you're breaking this law of replenishment. And
Yeah.
this is essentially what happens in Ireland over a long period. And the kind of main escalation of this really begins after the Cromwell invasion in 1650 or so. And with this invasion, I mean, an invasion is one word for it. In reality, this is a genocide. I think it was about a
Hmm.
quarter of the population were wiped out. And there's the kind of famous to hell or to
The
Connacht
Connacht. Yeah.
expression of the native Irish are all essentially pushed towards the west of Ireland, which becomes, of course, the key part of Ireland, which is suffering from the famine, which can also be interpreted as a continuation of the genocide of the indigenous Irish people and of the indigenous Irish culture.
Mm.
So, with this, Cromwell, so there was a famous rebellion in 1641, which again is another brief and a beautiful point in Irish history where we had a united Ireland
Mm.
under communal management, and this is something that they tried to evolve from and replicate to a certain extent with 1916 and 1919.
Yes.
And what happened after Cromwell invaded in just completely brutal fashion? He brought somebody with him called William Petty, and he was the first person really to survey the country of Ireland. The reason being is that the Cromwell invasion was sponsored by really kind of London financiers, and then there was a lot of land promised to these investors and to the kind of warriors who went and committed this genocide in Ireland. So that
Mm.
meant you had a large scale transfer of land from uh, the workers and the people of Ireland to largely absentee landlords.
Mm.
And this began a new phase of Irish history where it's, yes, you kind of have this Protestant ascendancy, as it's called, you have British, but you also have the foreign enterprise of landlordism,
Mm.
which actually, if you read a lot of the Irish revolutionary writers of particularly the 17 and 1800s, landlordism really is the thing that they call out
Want to
first and
abolish.
foremost,
Yeah.
as a system of robbery, essentially.
Hmm.
So this is the beginning really of this rift and the shift from agriculture for subsistence to agriculture for export. And when we see this, the struggle, historically, really, struggle is over something called, you can call it social surplus, or in this case, socio-ecological surplus, as in essentially the difference between what the worker gets to reap from their own work and what the actual monetary value of that is.
Yeah.
And that's what's appropriated by the profiteer.
Hmm.
So within this begins then a long and sad history of exploitation. And the first kind of significant flare up in this was a famine that happened in 1740, 1741. And this, again, can also be interpreted as a genocidal act. This was a famine that actually killed a higher percentage of the Irish population than on Gortamore in 1845. And it's a kind of a forgotten piece of Irish history
Not taught. It's
in
not
many
taught.
ways. Yeah, it's not
Mm.
taught.
Mm.
And this can be interpreted through different lenses, but what do we know is that there was a mini ice age that was happening on Earth at this point. Interestingly, this ice age was exacerbated by the British colonization of the Americas. And the reason being they committed a genocide over there. I shouldn't just say British, it was a European
Hmm.
colonial project. And they wiped out such a high amount of the indigenous population of Turtle Island that it caused a huge growth in vegetation. And what did that do is it lowered the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. What did it do? Essentially, ruined the harmony that existed. And what did this do actually was to accelerate and exacerbate a cooling period on the Earth. And this then uh, created famine in Ireland and in other parts of Europe, but in Ireland it was particularly bad because of the British landlord system of extraction. So,
It's really grim. It's really bleak, and it's just the reinforcement of what we know to be true, which is that indigeneity is key to the health of the entire world and planet and Earth and harmony.
yeah,
And when that is the bigger the assault on that, as is the case where the British in America, the worse the repercussions environmentally for the whole world.
yeah,
Um, and the correlation is just so starkingly like clear.
yeah,
It beggars belief that we are so thick, I'm going to say, as
yeah,
people, as a culture, that we could buy into a system that causes and does this when there is nothing but patterns of evidence in its wake, as well
yeah.
as destruction.
Yeah, at the same time, I have sympathy for us in that like this stupidity has been created very deliberately, you know?
Yeah.
And even, what we talked like this like idea of Éiriu, of sovereignty and of fertility.
Hmm.
And it's such a profound meaning because even you look at Ireland, you look at Éiriu, right? And Éiriu as a sovereign entity in herself, she lost her sovereignty. And she then lost
Mm.
her fertility, you
Yeah.
know? And this then happens over time where what does William Petty do is he basically um, states that Ireland should essentially just be the ranch of England. And
Yeah.
that the ultimate goal is really to remove the Irish people from the Irish land and essentially to replace us
With
with
cattle.
cattle. And this was, I think he said this in 1697, just to contextualize this.
Hmm.
So, what happened then is you have significant agrarian uprisings after this famine in 1740 because it becomes a battle for survival, really. It's um, like the indigenous connection to the land is the reason why they're so ecologically conscious is that their existence depends on it, right?
Yes.
And we see this then throughout agrarian uprisings that persist really kind of from about maybe 1760, where it kind of is the birth of the white boys. But you see it all throughout the country under many different names. You have the Oak Boys up north, you have the Wright Boys, you have the Ribbon Men up to the 1830s. It's very gendered language now that I'm saying these all
Yeah,
out loud.
yeah.
I hope there was some women and girls
You can be sure there were.
involved.
This is
Maybe it's
written out.
mankind. Yeah, I guess
We
they
were
were.
the brains, I'm sure, behind the
I
operation.
mean, yeah, it was the goddesses in Queen's Hive just pulling the strings.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They were
Yeah,
just, yeah, carrying it
just
out.
getting us to do your dirty work. So, so these agrarian uprisings continue and kind of reach their most advanced point then in 1798 with the Wolf Tone
Mhm.
Revolution.
Just
Um,
on just before we go to the 1798 revolution on these uprisings, I because I've just recently read about them in Labour and Irish history, and
mhm,
one thing that kind of struck me was the violence and barbarity with which they were suppressed. Now, they were themselves violent. I'm not claiming that they weren't,
mhm,
but when you consider how they were punished, which was like, dismemberment, hanging, public hanging, really, really, really brutally suppressed, you get
yeah,
a feeling of the scale of dehumanization and violence that had been inflicted on the people, and why these uprisings were by necessity brutal and violent in their method because they were so overpowered. And one other thing that I found interesting about that was how the public came out in support of them.
yeah,
Massively so, to the point that when they were tried in courts, the juries wouldn't convict, because they wouldn't. And
mhm,
to get control of it, they moved the hearings to other countries, I presume England,
yeah,
which is pretty incredible. So you can see that there's like this power base that kind of threatens to um, overpower this system, this brutal colonial system. And then you see the horror of how it is treated and how, but the courage it took for uh, them to stand against. Excuse me.
yeah,
So,
exactly. Mhm. Sorry, go on.
no, and bring us to 1798 then, I was going to say.
Yeah, but it's like very important for us to kind of remember this lineage too, I think, in terms of
Mm,
like each generation, you even see how they invoke the previous ones,
yeah,
and it's a
yeah.
kind of constant state of evolution in that like without the white boys, you don't have maybe the Oak boys. Even though the white boys were largely Catholic, the Oak boys were a significant portion of them were Protestant.
And the working class Catholic and Protestants could work in harmony together. Those
Yeah,
divisions were absolutely stoked because obviously the power of their unity was to be feared by we know who. Yeah.
exactly. And like the best example of that is Wolfe Tone. He was a Protestant, and
Yeah.
I was telling you, I like my great grandfather. He kept a prison diary when he was in prison during the Civil War in 1922, 1923, and it's nice even reading him. And he talks about all of these people of the likes of Wolfe Tone, Mitchell, Davis, Lawler, and the people who went before him. Uh,
Inspire, taking inspiration from them. And here he is in the heart of the Rising and the War of Independence, reading and basically taking notes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And like even like what did he say about Wolf Tone? He said basically Wolf Tone, he's like the most lovable of all revolutionaries. And even in the prison they had a Wolf Tone group and they would have, read him together and he was for him his kind of one of his big inspirations alongside Mitchell, who he ended up naming his son after. But with the United Irishmen, 1798, This was then kind of, as typically happens, you have 1641, you then have the Cromwell counter-revolution, you have the 1798 rebellion, you have
Hmm.
1801, which was the Act of Union. And that
Yeah.
essentially kind of dissolved the Irish Parliament, officially designated Ireland as a regional economy within the United Kingdom. And that meant another big restructuring of the Irish economy. And this basically happened because of the Napoleonic Wars, and the British needed a huge increase in food production in order to feed their soldiers. And
Mhm.
this meant, again, to a big shift in the Irish agricultural system. And it also led to a big population boom in Ireland, where the population in a relatively short period almost doubled from about 4.5 to 8 million people. And the colonial structure in terms of the agricultural system was maintained in terms of this like absentee landlord system, where you have the kind of Anglo-Irish comprador or middleman that's
Mhm.
kind of managing the affairs of the estate. They're then likely renting out to another middleman, to another, in
Yeah.
this kind of system that's referred to as rack renting. And it's
Hmm.
essentially where each person on the food chain is trying to extract as much as possible from the person below. And at the
Yeah.
bottom of this food chain, you have the Irish peasants and the cottiers, as they were called.
Yeah.
And these people were crucial to the land's fertility as a whole, because they were the people that were doing the back-breaking work to maintain the soil's fertility. So
Yes.
in Ireland, the kind of indigenous practice for agriculture were these kind of ridge and furrows, or they're called lazy beds. And that's
Mm.
essentially these little mounds that you see. These are what created a lot of these funny hills all throughout rural Ireland.
Yeah.
And they would have, in order to maintain the soil's fertility, literally scoured the island for shite, for from
Yeah.
cows,
So to
for
fertilize the land.
scoured the shores for seaweed.
Seaweed, yeah.
And they would have
Mhm.
done really difficult work digging down into the hard pan of the soil to resurface the nutrients which had seeped down into it.
Hmm. Hmm.
So over time, because the majority of the British, or the majority of the food being grown in Ireland was being exported,
Hmm.
essentially that broke how the natural cycles worked. So this created this rift or this rupture. So the
Yeah.
nutrients that should have worked their way back into the soil were instead being exported and ending up in British waste or waterways.
Yeah.
And this meant you see a gradual degradation of Irish soil fertility during this period. And this is something Marx described as robbery agriculture. So,
Yeah.
with the British system, they would have been over in Peru scouring the beach for a specific kind of bird shit that can be used as fertilizer. It's called guana. They were scouring the battlefields of Europe for human bones, to add to their soil, and then essentially robbing Éiriu's fertility at the same time in order to keep their system going. So, with this, we see this kind of reoccurring throughout history in colonial relationships, where you have something called like unequal exchange or ecologically unequal exchange. And that being sort of the destruction is done in the periphery, the benefits are all enjoyed in the core.
Yeah. Sacrifice zones is another term I've heard for them. Yeah.
Exactly. And
Mm.
maybe we can use that word again later on in this
Yeah.
discussion if we get time to kind of go to the modern day.
Yeah.
But basically, with this, over time, the law of replenishment is being broken and the soil fertility essentially collapses. So you have this happening on one side, because then what do you have is the system of landlordism, agriculture for profit, and you have the increasing power of the cattle ranchers. So what's happening is that the peasants and the cottiers are slowly being kicked off their land because of the rack renting system, that they essentially just can't afford to stay on their own lands anymore and they're evicted.
Yeah.
So because these people aren't then deliberately contributing to the soil's fertility,
Hmm.
it collapses even further
Yeah.
because they're not doing the work of manuring,
Replenishing.
seed, and hard pan digging. And for the British, actually, this is fine. And by the British also, I mean Irish landlords too.
Yes. And let's
And
not forget their crucial role. Yeah.
yeah. And within this, they're essentially clearing the estate, is how Marx referred to it as clearing the estate of Ireland. And why? Because the Napoleon Wars end. The Act of Union essentially destroys Irish industry, meaning there's no alternative in Ireland for workers to go to.
Hmm.
You then have huge land clearances of farmers who want to have cattle pasture, which is far more profitable than tillage. The British lift the corn laws, meaning they can then get corn from anywhere in the world that they want.
Hmm.
And the Irish working class are forced to live off a diet of potatoes,
Yeah.
only potatoes. And this then it turns into crisis with the potato blight. So what happens in this period then is you not only have the collapse of the soil's fertility as a result of the British extractive system, but you also have about twice as much food as would be necessary to feed the Irish population being exported.
Leaving. Hmm.
So, you hear Connolly saying, that the potato brought the blight, but the British brought the famine,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
he even talks about actually to go further into that, he says, and it's not the fault of any British individual, just the system that they're
Mm.
imposing on us. And
Hmm.
actually, they're operating exactly within the laws of their ethical framework, that being private profit accumulation.
Yeah.
So within this, you see then a complete ecological, socio-ecological collapse as a result of losing sovereignty and then fertility. And with this, you see in the 5 year period, I believe, between 1845 and 1850, or maybe it's 10 years, you have a population decrease of about 2 million. At the same time, you see 2 million cattle
Two and
introduced.
a half, isn't it?
Two and a
Did I
half
read that
million.
yesterday? More cattle.
Yeah.
They squeezed a bit more cattle in than people.
Yeah. So, when you hear about great replacement, this is the true great replacement that has really happened on this island. And when we look at that, what was also happening was that the British and the Americans needed laborers for their industrial revolutions. So you saw millions of people going to the British industrial centers, to the States, as well as, at least 1 million people dying in that 5 to 10 year period as well. But the famine actually continued for decades after. Obviously, the most
Mm.
extreme parts ended, and they really only became less extreme because so many people died or had to emigrate. And the fertility of the soil continued to worsen because you didn't have the native stewards, the
Yeah.
cottiers and the peasants who were
Replenishing it.
actually regenerating the soil.
You had cattle who were being grazed and exported, grazed and exported, raised, grazed, exported in that endless cycle of extraction.
Exactly, and they
Um,
were they were exported also significantly not as beef. This
yeah,
weren't even allowed to process beef for another century,
yeah.
but they were exported as cattle themselves, and these cattle are essentially, I don't know how much a cattle weighs, but like hundreds of kilos worth of
Mm,
embodied nutrients that were then
mm,
exported. And what this also meant was that the whole system had to change because it was largely uh, built on kind of small holdings that were based on subsistence for tenants and for production of
mm.
grain. And then for cattle, you need much larger spaces for pasture. So you see a huge consolidation of land into a much smaller group of people. These are often called graziers.
Yeah.
And you see then the graziers really becoming the new power structure in Ireland. And with this, you see again the continuation and acceleration of this clearance of the estate of Ireland, which then gives rise to some of the more sophisticated agrarian resistance
Yeah.
movements, which leads into the Fenians and why Marx offered his public support to the Fenians and told the British workers that they can never be free unless they support the Irish struggle for liberation.
Yes, I love that. I've come to look at cows so differently in the past year. And since I've begun to learn about the history of the Irish economy under colonization, I've come to really actually hate the sight of them in massive fields. And I think what sums it up is this quote actually that I just read yesterday or the day before in a pamphlet written by Padre O'Donnell about a book. For decades now, the bullock and the Irish peasant have faced each other in enmity, and the victory of the one has meant that there was no room in Ireland for the other.
Brilliant quote. I love Padre O'Donnell.
Yeah, talk about your connection to Padre O'Donnell, actually.
Yeah, well, I only found this recently because I was going through the military archives and I found on my great grandmother, Daisy Cogley, her military pension. He was one of the referees on the pension. And he would have been in Mountjoy at the same time as two of my great grandparents. And he was kind of the commander in prison during this
Yeah.
time. And I read his book, one of his books. It's called "And the Gates Flew Open." It's very short, but it's such a fantastic
Mm.
insight into kind of life in this period and in prison. He ended up escaping from prison actually, and he went to fight for the Spanish Republic against Franco in the 30s. He was just a true socialist Republican,
Really,
a true
as your grandparents were.
yeah, yeah, and just so you
Mm.
know, a real internationalist, and also just has great insights into kind of the agrarian side of the struggle too. Peadar O'Donnell was from Donegal, um, but there's so much insight to be learned from him, from many of these
Yeah.
writers. I think
Mm.
I even quoted Peadar O'Donnell a couple of weeks ago on this podcast with you. He's talking about Michael Collins and his
Yes.
inability to understand how imperialism actually works rather than
Yes.
just the occupation of Ireland by British troops. It's actually the control of the Irish economy by British interests. And that
Mhm.
never went away.
That
And that was
never
the
went
real
away.
struggle.
We never really won the true fight, the fight that has been waged by the resistance groups throughout the centuries, which was the abolishment of landlordism and the ability to live in right relationship with the land. And to do that, you need possession of it, whether it be communal, not necessarily has to be private. That was never really enshrined as a core value of the Irish people, more that there was a shared access, open and fair access to the lands and the means of survival. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
That was the core tenet of Fenianism is like the land for the people. Very simple,
yes, the land
but
for the
just a
people.
beautiful slogan. And with
Mm.
this, I mean, with the Fenian movement then founded 1858. So really during
After the famine.
famine,
Yeah.
and they then kind of went on, a lot of the people, most significantly Michael Davitt, he and Parnell went on to lead then the Land League.
Hmm.
And they had probably more success that you can kind of measure than any other group, perhaps in Irish history. And they were able to win significant concessions. And it was their momentum that really carried into Home Rule, which of course never happened. But the fact it didn't happen, it made it turn into 1916
Yes.
and for the demands made to be far more progressive than what even Home Rule could have delivered. So through this, you see then in terms of the struggle for land, through the Land League and the Land Acts in the 90s, 1890s and up to 1903, I think, there was significant redistribution of land where I think the Irish peasantry went from owning about 6% of the land to about 14% in the space of a decade or so, which is very significant in terms
Mhm.
of that transition. Now, the British kind of adapted to this and tried to control in another way. So what did they do was kind of make the ownership dependent on the peasants getting loans from the British so that they
Mm.
can kind of try and control them through debt rather than outright occupation or ownership.
Mhm.
And this victory, it also kind of galvanized the other parts of the Irish population because they saw what was possible through resistance.
Mhm.
And this then is kind of what led to the momentum outside of Dublin in particular. And it was really the kind of synchronization of the labor movement in Dublin, especially kind of from the lockout
Mhm.
in 1913,
1913.
organized by Larkin and Connolly. So they organized the Dublin workers, and then you had really kind of the evolution of the Fenians and the Land League organizing the rural
Mm.
workers
Cattle
together.
runs and the likes. Yeah.
And that's kind of what made the revolutionary period of kind of say 1912 to 1922 so effective because you
Mm.
had a very united working class that was agrarian, it was workers' movement, it was Republican, it was socialist, it was nationalist, and managed to really unite the country. And by Republican, it's kind of forgotten now, but republicanism was always meant to be the great equalizer between Protestants and
Mm.
Catholics, and hence
Mhm.
the green, white, and orange flag.
Yeah.
Was that it brought these people together under shared interest towards a common goal. So you then have obviously 1916, you have the Democratic Mandate of 1919, and very significantly in these documents, they start off firstly by men and women, and then they also mention the soil twice in the one
Mm.
little bit of text, and it's like remarkable to see the soil of Ireland really mentioned, and also the surplus of Ireland subjugated to the common interest of the people. And that
Mm.
nothing will be exported until everyone's fed. And
Mhm.
that old people, young people, vulnerable will all be protected first and foremost. And now, today, we have 20,000 homeless people on the streets, whilst we apparently have one of the highest GDP per capita in human history. Like these are the good times now.
Can you
And
imagine what it's going to be like when things are scarce, if these are the good times?
yeah, and
Mm.
given what's happening around the world, we don't seem too far away from things taking a very
A turn
negative turn.
yeah. And this will all come into play. Our food sovereignty is going to, we're going to understand it in a very different way very soon.
Yeah, exactly. And like even in terms of, yeah, again, this idea of sovereignty, we don't have food sovereignty. We don't have energy
Mm.
sovereignty. We don't have sovereignty over foreign policy. I can't actually think of anything we do have sovereignty over, come to
No.
think of it. And with this, like, what happens, like, and why there's, I think, a big kind of divide maybe that's growing in Ireland or that's growing around the world is we're being told we live in a climate crisis. We're being told we live in a housing crisis. We're being told there's going to be a world war that's probably already started realistically.
Yeah.
And we're also not being told there's a plan for any of these things, you know?
Mm.
And there obviously is one.
Exactly.
Somebody has
And
one.
we're not privy to that because it isn't in our interests. This plan is being devised.
Yeah. So
And
like where
yeah, I mean, history tells us the working class people have to look out for their own interests.
yeah,
It's not
and it
going to
tells
be.
us like in times of scarcity, the capitalist system that allocates all resources based on how profitable they are rather than taking care of the people, you get collapse.
You
And
get
we've seen
genocide.
it
You get
here.
people dying. You get like the email we spoke about in our Epstein series, how do you get rid of the world's poor?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
You're talking about human beings being reduced, as in the case of Ireland, like to less than cattle.
Yeah, and then it's like, what's Ireland being used for today? And maybe this is a good jump we can make to today's struggles
Yeah.
is like what has our role been historically in relation to the great imperialist powers? And it had been essentially England's farm.
Hmm.
That's what we have historically been. And if you look at Irish land use today, still maybe two-thirds of Irish land is agricultural, and maybe two-thirds of that is cattle and sheep.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
like, still the majority of our
Same
land
model.
is being
Mm.
used for cattle and dairy and sheep.
Hmm.
And a very small minority is actually used for tillage and subsistence. And even the way that this farming is done is heavily dependent on cheap artificial pesticides and fertilizers, which are actively destroying the foundations that the agricultural system is built on.
Hmm.
So we're in a very precarious position when you factor in a world war, when you factor in environmental breakdown, and just to kind of position ourselves today, like where we are, yes, but also when we are. We're actually living in the middle of the sixth mass extinction. This is right now happening, where even in the last 50 years, we've lost, I think, 74% of our wildlife, maybe, or wildlife vertebrates. We have
Mm.
now a complete collapse in terms of our insect population, which are at the foundation of the web of life. Our soil, without pesticides and fertilizers, is in such a degraded state that we don't even know what it could produce for us without these chemicals. And even in terms of the concentration of who owns even the seeds, there's two
Mm.
companies which own about half of global seeds that are used for agriculture, you know? So, with this, the Paris Agreement, which was agreed in 2015, the target for that was originally 1.5 degrees of warming. The reason
Yeah.
why that was chosen was because past 1.5 degrees, we're into very unpredictable territory. We're at this like tipping point. Once you pass the tipping point, it's unpredictable. Uh, you
Mhm.
have potentially cascading effects once you pass this point. Um, right now, we're at 1.6 degrees.
Yeah.
Um,
So it's begun. It's begun. And
yeah,
we're in the chaos, and what we're observing around us that we are aware of or made aware of is World War III. We're seeing
yeah,
the
and they're very
US
connected.
openly talk about extermination campaigns in Latin America.
Yeah,
We're like explicitly calling themselves the Department of War, the most unhinged public figure of modern times, in all caps, talking about how he's going to massively explode things.
yeah.
Um, and like the precarity of our living conditions because of what's happening in Iran, really, it's difficult to overstate actually, because there, with the closing of the Strait of Hormuz, how it will impact us
Hmm.
is because of things like the reliance of Europe on fertilizer.
And
That
energy,
isn't, yeah, that
both
isn't,
fossil based.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And because we don't have the systems set up here to be sovereign, in terms of our food supply,
Uh-huh.
what it all means and how urgent it is for us to awaken to this.
Yeah.
It's
And sorry, go on.
no, 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 you go.
So yeah, even with this now, like I remember I used to be like a youth ambassador for the European Union. So
Mm.
I'd get to go to like conferences around bioeconomy and food and these things. And I at this point had been lecturing in sustainability and like there had been a big awakening a few years ago in environmentalism that seems to have kind of faded because of war. But at this period, a lot of my students were always asking me, like what do we do? What's the plan? And
Yeah.
like we're living in the midst of collapse. It's a process that we're living through
Mhm.
now. And
Mhm.
like, what happens? Especially, one tipping point, for example, is called the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridian Ocean Current. And that's what keeps Europe's temperature from being about 10 degrees colder. It's like the Gulf
Mhm.
Stream, sort of. And this could reverse this decade. This is like what scientists tell us. And that means food production in Europe collapses. And I asked this, I got to speak on a youth panel at the Food 2030 conference, and I just like said, what happens if this does happen? Like we're being told it
Mhm.
could, and
Mhm.
like on one hand, we're being told we should be so worried about like Russian ships in the Atlantic. Yes, we just shouldn't even ask a question about the collapse of the ocean currents in the same Atlantic.
Yep.
And we're being
Yeah.
told the AMOC has about a 50% chance of collapse in the next 10 years. Let's say Russians, for some reason, decide to invade Ireland. There's what, maybe 1% chance of that happening in the next 10 years? Or
We'll
let's say
say
even
not point, not
10%.
one,
Who
maybe. Yeah.
knows? But like, we're willing to like essentially break the bank for this. Yes, when it comes to uh, something that has far more significant consequences, even if they were to both happen, no plan. Just
No
no,
plan.
don't ask about that. Don't ask about that. And like again, it's something that is just uh to me just very disrespectful about how they even think of the Irish population or the global population is we don't get a seat at the table. We
Mm.
don't get a say in how these things play out. And again, why is that they are trying to just make money from it. You go to these conferences, it's like dizzying sometimes because they're just trying to come up with business ideas to profit from the collapse.
I know that's how sick capitalism is.
Yeah.
Like even with you start off looking for a solution and you end up becoming part of the problem that makes profit.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that's all that the system allows for because if you come up with an idea that's not profitable, it doesn't
It's
matter.
no good. It's no good. And profitability runs counter to nature. And yeah, there's something in the collective that needs to shift in terms of our awareness of how things actually are.
Yeah,
Because we talk, I suppose, about power structures today and how out of sync they are with nature. But to a
yeah.
certain degree, there are still people who are looking to this system and the figures that run it for answers or for plans or for solutions.
Mhm.
And there's kind of a madness in that. And it points to the disconnection, I suppose, we've all had over time and centuries to our right relationship with the land. That instead of having the first relationship with the land as
Mhm.
the authority, we're looking to these figures that have actually taken away the very,
Yeah.
very like best of our like health and life and relationship with the land for an answer. And it's never going to come from there.
No.
Never. So for us as well, there's something that needs to shift in us to understand fully that our fate is tied to us, not to these figures, not to these systems. And
Mhm.
how are we going to do that and what's it going to look like? And are we brave enough to do it? Because there is a kind of a rupture that needs to happen between
Yeah.
those systems and us. And that's what it needs to be as a rupture, because we're not going to vote our way into better capitalism. We're not going to
No.
plead to the moral conscience of people who have actually screened their genocide of an entire people to us and have not as much as acknowledged their fault in it, their part in it. So there's something that we need to do to entirely shift away from that. And I don't know if we've spoken about it here before, but right now, like there are signs of that happening in
Mm.
Irish society.
Yeah.
There is kind of the emergence of what could look like, in time, local assemblies or communal cooperation for the benefit of the general good. You see the emergence of like, I can't think of the name of the organization. Malu Culleran, who has been on this podcast before, um, is uh, is funding with an organization for a wool mill, for example, because you know
Ah, brilliant. Yeah,
the wool
yeah.
industry in Ireland was obviously never developed, and because the wool has to
You
be,
sent it to me before. Is it Fiber Shed?
that's it. Thank
Yeah,
you, fibre shed. Um, the cost of basically processing and producing wool is prohibitive. It's not possible because it has to be exported because you know the industry was never developed here because cattle
yeah.
and
Same structure.
basically because of cattle. And they're doing that now, and that gives me massive hope. I read a story as well last night about a Kerry woman who's
Oh,
redeveloping a 2 acre glass house to feed her
yeah,
community. And I thought,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
legend.
yeah.
Rupa Maria, who's also been on the Clear Lens, and her
Mm.
food is
It's
medicine.
brilliant. Yeah.
Amazing. And the work that she's doing and others like in her community. So this is where we need to look to, isn't it? This is
Oh,
100%.
not to mention what we were up to over the last weekends, Audrey, in our own backyard.
Planting myself.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. Returning ourselves. Like I
Exactly.
bought a load of seeds, and I've no clue what I'm doing, but I say to myself, it's as natural as breathing. You
Yeah,
know, like we can kind of tend to overcomplicate this, probably because of our alienation
yeah,
from where we get our food and how we eat.
yeah,
But yeah, I've done that, and you yourself, few
yeah.
spuds.
Got my eye on a few spuds out there now. Let's see what happens. I also don't know what I'm doing, but gotta start somewhere, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we all, I suppose, we have whatever means we have to do it. You know, me myself, I'm in a bog standard semi-D house with a
Mm.
small enough garden, but you know, there's still plenty of space to at least start. And
Yeah.
as they grow and thrive, hopefully, I'll expand.
Yeah, you just reminded me of this, it's of the Bobby Sands quote. He says, "Everyone, Republican or otherwise, has their own particular part to play. No part is too great or too small. No one is too old or too young." And that can be as simple as just
Lovely.
planting something, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
But also you see it in the Irish language revival, you know? You see it in the upsurge in the connection we have to our own history. You know, we were even just talking about even the Easter lily. I'm seeing
Yeah.
them all over the city now, you know? And
Amazing.
young people now are really kind of going back into our roots, our inspirations, our
Mm.
own family histories,
Mhm.
and taking great inspiration from them, you know? And
Yeah.
this idea of like, reconnecting to place. You see now even the quarter day festivals, which I mentioned earlier, as these are key dates of alignment, of socio-ecological alignment, and just connecting back to Éiriu. And you see huge crowds up on the Hill of Ishnock at
Beautiful.
Newgrange. And
Yeah.
it's amazing to see this resurgence. And, there's a lot of negative discourse at the moment about, the growth of the far right and all the rest. But what
Yeah.
doesn't get enough attention is really the regeneration of Gaelic culture. And if you again look back into Irish history and you look at the Gaelic League,
Mm.
a lot of the most prominent Irish revolutionaries would credit the Gaelic League as the foundation of 1916.
Yeah.
And like even to me, someone who's always so inspirational is Padraig Pearse. And,
Mm.
he was an educator. He also really put a lot of emphasis and focus on Irish mythology, on the language. He had his own school and he, is arguably like the most inspirational Irish revolutionary in history. I mean, he was kind of the driving force of 1916 along with James Connolly.
Yeah. He's
And you
so committed.
see the connections that are being made once again between ourselves, the land, our ancestors, our history. It is happening,
Yeah, it is
and
happening.
the challenge is
Old
like,
wounds.
how do we translate this into action, and like, there's a Frantz Fanon quote. I can't remember it exactly, but he says like each generation, out of relative obscurity, must discover its mission, fulfill it or betray it in relative opacity. You know, and it's up to us really to discover what is our mission today. What is our context and what is our role, not only as Irish people, but just as expressions of the totality of life? And what is it that we need to do at this point in history in order to give life a chance to continue? And I think in Ireland today, I just want to mention, considering this is like an ecological episode, is the ongoing struggles against extraction in Ireland today.
Mhm.
And I know we've spoken a little bit about Aughinish before, and really just such legends that are continuing the struggle today. I know you know a few of them, maybe actually.
Yeah, yeah. Melina Sharp and her mom, Christina Sharp, and Melina's partner, Michael, they're
Mhm.
absolutely amazing and they're
Mhm.
just relentless. And they are like Shannon, like my area, right in my doorstep is what you could call a sacrifice zone.
Mhm.
Um, Plans have been approved for the development of however many 100 acres of a data center, a monster of a thing,
Mhm.
not far from where I live, out in the motorway.
Mhm.
And I suppose in tandem with that are plans for two separate LNG terminals on the
Yeah.
Shannon. One in West Clare in Kildysert and another in the Shannon Estuary. And it's really, really gross to see how local politicians have acted as true compradors in
Mhm.
facilitating this. Um, and you start to see and understand more so when it's on your doorstep just how much of a client state Ireland is, because you see the wider things at play in policies, which is that Europe has agreed to buy 650 billion in frack gas from the US.
Mhm.
For the import of that, these terminals obviously need to exist. And these data centers, which offer no benefit, which offer nothing but harm to a local community in
Mhm.
terms of environmental impact, in terms of energy consumption, in terms of water consumption, um, are being planted. Um, and what are they doing? What are they storing? It is it's happening with the proliferation of AI,
Yeah.
which is going to replace the means of living for an awful lot of people. And not just that, but also this surveillance state that is on the rise across the world. And you would
Yeah.
have to be blind not to be able to see it. So once again, you see how we are being sold the tools of our own oppression as something that is positive. Like they're talking about employment. Data centers don't employ people. Data centers are these monstrous, like empty, creepy places. Like I would hate to walk inside one and see the servers and just like just how anti-life they would even feel inside in them. But the politicians are doing the usual, spinning it as great for enterprise, great for employment. And I
Mhm.
don't know, I guess there are people that still fall for that, but I do think that we're waking up.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of activism happening locally.
Yeah.
And I hope to talk to Melina and Michael on here about the scale of that and about what we can all do and how we can all tune in to what's happening around us.
Yeah. Yeah. And like even now, you know, just in March, from the beginning to the end of March, the price of a barrel of oil went from $72 to 112. You know, that's the biggest jump in history, recorded history. Um, and what does an increase in the price of fossil fuels do? It essentially acts as a tax on all economic activity because fossil fuels still power 80% of our energy. And for every 1% growth in GDP, you get a 1% growth in energy. Like these things are one-to-one correlated. So that means we get severe inflation.
Mm.
And at the same time, you have data center expansion, which they already take 20% of our energy. It happened like this. No one even
Yeah.
noticed. And
No.
now it's meant to take a third. And when is
Mm.
it going to stop? You know, there's
Mm.
no plan. It's just
Mm.
extract and like, they're literally parasites on our natural resources, these data centers.
Yeah.
And like you say, what are they actually serving? And increasingly, what are they serving is oppression, militarized AI, surveillance,
Hmm.
and social media platforms, which are trying to use our data to manipulate us into consuming
Hmm.
more
Hmm.
amidst environmental breakdown as a
Yeah.
result of overconsumption? So it's
Hmm.
just like no sense, but it's the logic that caused the famine, and it's the logic that has us in the middle of a mass extinction. And this is what needs to be changed. And this is why I think, that there's these struggles going on, Aughanish, Shannon Estuary, LNG,
Hmm.
data centers throughout Ireland. You then have the agricultural struggle, and the struggle between cattle for export and profit, or perhaps something like agroecology in Ireland, where you have agriculture that works in harmony with nature. And perhaps the most advanced agroecological project on Earth today is perhaps in Cuba, where they
Hmm.
have such a highly sophisticated system of agroecology there. And this beautiful experiment is again under threat by US imperialism. They want to destroy any alternative futures that
Hmm.
humanity is trying to or has ever tried to create. So we see all of these kind of linking up. We see the Sperrins campaign. We see even in Dublin, like the struggle against landlordism here. It's all the same struggle, you know?
All this.
So our job is really to try and connect all of these struggles together and ensure that the struggle is against the system itself, the system of extraction, of
Hmm.
parasitism,
Hmm.
of endless accumulation, and reorganize the system towards social and ecological needs. This is the struggle. It's always been the struggle, you know?
Yes.
And
But
we've
surely we get
seen,
better each time. Each
yeah,
time we rise, we get better and we progress a little bit more. And I think at this time, we're looking back on 1916 and especially the week that's in it, coming up to Easter,
mhm,
is a lovely time for this conversation as well.
yeah,
What is the best that we can take from that time, and like, the empowerment that we can give to ourselves for it. And for me, nothing brings that to life like your own family history. Like,
yeah,
we all know who the superstars are that we learned about in school, but there's nothing as powerful as learning your own family history. And for a lot of us, that was buried. And I
yeah,
speak for myself in that regard because what followed the War of Independence was a bitter civil war. There's nothing worse than a civil war in terms of dividing and splitting a nation. And so it wasn't tales told kind of happily around the fire after that period. It was people committed crimes and things that they never could really live with or make peace with, and divisions that destroy people and traumatize them.
yeah,
So we were severed from what could otherwise have been a rich history. And looking back now, it's incredible to learn. And look, I'm not saying our ancestors are perfect. There were things about my great grandfather that I greatly admire. And then there was the fact that he took the treaty side after, which is, given my politics and my worldview. But what I say to myself is that I never was on the run for my country. I never took a bullet for my country. I never slept in reeds beside a lake. I was never put in a donkey cart bleeding
yeah,
because I was trying to, and maybe the role is for me to take it to the place where it should have gone after there. And maybe that's where the healing happens. Um, and like your history, Dara, that like is absolutely incredible. How connected your great grandparents were right to the heart of the struggle. Was it Owen MacNeill that handed your great grandfather the um the letter about the GPO? That there was that it was all kicking off.
So there was a couple of references. So within 1916, so my great grandfather Fred, he was working in the Independent at the time, but he was
Mhm.
also working for An Poblacht. He was working for the Irish Bulletin, the Irish Citizen, and kind of had been active as a revolutionary journalist for at least kind of 20 years. So there was kind of two documents I found. One is from Liam O'Vryn, and
Mhm.
in this he talks about how basically. Um, the letter, the cancelling order on Easter Sunday to have the revolution the following day, was given to Fred outside the GPO. He went down on the night of the rising because he wanted to go and meet Sean McDermott, who he had been a colleague of, because Sean McDermott was also a journalist with him.
Yeah.
So there is a great statement. It's by Michael Knightley. So he talks about basically the two of them go down to the GPO, meet with Sean McDermott, and he's then saying like, "You need to get out of here," because actually he had just had a son, Mitchell, who is
Is your grandfather?
it's my dad's grandfather, Mitchell.
Oh yeah, you're. Oh yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
who's named after George Mitchell, who was a legendary figure from the Irish 1800s. And he says to him, like, this is no place for a married man, and you've just had a son, and you should get
Yeah,
out of here, whatever. And he says, can you take my money? I won't be needing it. And he says, no, I'm not taking that off
yeah.
you. I'm not going to kind of acknowledge that. So anyway, off
Mm.
he goes back to the Independent, 2 a.m., and publishes this in the paper. And at this time, like the two of them, so Fred and his wife Daisy, who was born in France but with an Irish mother, and the two of them were very deeply involved all throughout the revolutionary period. And in her military pensions, it even says like how Constance Markovich essentially lived in their home on Stephen's Green in this
It's
period. How
incredible. It's
yeah, and they would
absolutely
have
incredible. So you didn't lick it off a stone, Tara.
but it's
This
like
is
it's
in
such
the
an
blood.
inspiration. Yeah, and like they even would have been doing a lot of gun running, ammunition storing, of first aid for any injured soldiers, and would have very much continued this through to the Tan War 1919-1921. So I guess who knows? They may have met at some point, our
Yeah.
ancestors, and fought on the same side in the British Counter Revolution. And
Yeah.
then, you have the Anglo-Irish Agreement, 1921, and this was a major compromise, and what many deemed to be traitorous, in particular the partition of Ireland and
Mm.
a betrayal of the Irish Republic. And
Yeah.
many saw it, most, I think, that did vote for it and fight for the Free State, they saw it as a very temporary agreement. Like
It
the partition
reduced.
was only, it wasn't really discussed that much, even. I mean, the main thing was actually the oath of allegiance to the crown.
That's right.
They
Yeah.
all assumed it was going to only be a couple of years and it would be resolved and that it was just a stepping stone, etc. In the end, we all know now that that wasn't the case.
Mhm.
But they had their ideals. And, even in 1919, there was like even a Limerick Soviet set up, and there was, such a revolutionary energy around the country. And I think what history shows us, whether it's the Good Friday Agreement, whether it's the Anglo-Irish Agreement, is that compromise, when you have extremely unequal circumstances and relationships to your occupier, typically doesn't work out as planned.
No.
Now, it can be beneficial as a stepping stone, provided that's allowed for, like we saw maybe with the Land Acts, but that really the mission for humanity today, it has to be the end of the capitalist system.
Yeah. And a return to the earth. We only want the earth.
We only want the earth. Yeah, as James Connolly
Yeah.
famously wrote about, we only want the earth. It's not so much to ask. Let us go back to the land. Let us actually live in harmony with each other and with our
Hmm.
environments once more. Stop making us compete against each other for everything. Stop creating all of this artificial scarcity, pushing people into homelessness and precarity. And let us belong once more
Yeah.
to our home, our one home, Mother Earth, that unites us all. We
Yes.
all belong to Earth at the end of the day. We all have Mother Earth in common. And we're at the point where this should unite all of us, more so than any of the divisions being imposed on us today.
Yeah, and let us see the return to health of Éiriu, where sovereignty and fertility are achieved, and that we stop this artificial nonsense and worship of the invisible hand of the capitalist market, which isn't invisible at all. As we all know, it's pulled, the strings are pulled by a tiny group of the most corrupt and depraved humans. Um, yeah, I think we'll leave it there. And I'll finish by saying that our next chat is going to take off nicely from here with Conor McCabe, who Dara and I have said before is probably Ireland's best economist. And like you said yesterday, probably the world's best scholar on James Connolly.
Yeah, so he's
So
just done a huge transcription of a lot of James Connolly's unpublished works. So I'm very excited to
very,
listen.
very looking forward to our next chat. And hopefully we've given some really, really good context and groundwork for the beginning of that conversation with Conor McCabe, so that by the end of these, which are kind of like a mini two-part series, you'll be in no doubt about the structure of the Irish economy, the decisions that shaped it, and what needs to happen to turn this hot mess around.
Thanks,
Thank,
Audrey. See you
thank
next week.
you. Yes.